SEP FanFic Readings presents The Watergaw by smokybaltic and ectoheart. Chapter 4. This little odyssey needed to end. Hermione felt certain she had now spent more time with Draco Malfoy than any human was ever meant to. There was a reason the rich built their houses so bloody big, she realized now. It was an ingenious remedy to the ill of having to bear one another's company. Boarding school was another inspired solution. One day he would marry some wealthy, insufferable pure-blood witch who would have her own wing of the manor, and he would have his, and that woman, who in Hermione's mind was somehow both long-suffering and a stuck-up harpy, would surely not spend half as much time with Draco as Hermione now had. Nor would their horrible, spoilt, inbred offspring. The Git hadn't said a word about the hinky-punk. They had packed up their things and built their fire back up enough to heat the tin of beans. Hermione filled 2 empty tins with conjured water and brewed pine needle tea, something she explained was not only safe but healthful. He accepted her assurances without question. They had agreed on a strategy for the day, climbing the least formidable-looking hill, with almost no debate. He asked, politely, if she wouldn't mind stowing his suit jacket in her bag since the weather seemed fine. He offered to carry the bag. He was coddling her. She could feel him watching her now as if she were at a constant risk of doing something stupid, like she was a liability, like he needed to be kind to her lest she become overwhelmed. Obviously, he now thought she was so utterly incompetent that she was unequal to his antagonism. Even Ron. She loved Ron, truly she did, and thought he had many wonderful qualities. But even Ron rose to the level of being worth aggravating to Draco's estimation. It was humiliating. Where was the fucking respect? It would not do. It absolutely would not do. One way or another, she would show the condescending arsehole that she was more than capable of handling herself, both mentally and physically. She began with a long-winded and painfully detailed treatise on the principle of artificianimate quasi-dominance as they moved through the trees at the foot of the hill. He nodded along, asked pertinent questions, and civilly held branches aside so she could pass. When they reached a particularly steep incline, he had the audacity to offer her his hand. She slapped it away. "I'm fine," she said tersely, even as she fairly had to crawl up the steep slope. He kept checking in to see if she wanted to stop for rest or food. She wished he would just make fun of her for the damn hinky-punk already. Keeping up the pace her ego demanded was exhausting. She had yammered at Draco all morning about the most complex and obscure topics she could think of. She made deliberately outrageous claims. All she got back was polite interest and good manners. She was reaching her limit. She was spoiling for a fight. When they stopped for a rest on a bit of relatively flat grass, she watched through narrowed eyes as he complacently ran his hand over a patch of little snowdrop flowers, apparently lost in thought. Smug. She wanted to punch him in his stupid pointy face. "Why are you acting like this?" The question burst into the silence, laced with all the venom she'd been storing up since the morning. He had the audacity to look surprised. "Like what?" he puzzled. "All nice," she sneered. "Fake. I know you think I'm lower than dirt. Why put on the stupid show?" "It's not a show." "Please don't insult my intelligence. You're a Death Eater. I'm a mudblood. You've never been anything but a prick to me before this." His brow furrowed. "Is that what you want?" "I just don't see the point in pretending we don't hate each other." The catalyst might have been her bruised ego, but the words and the vitriol that were pouring out of her had been simmering for days, some of it for years. He was quiet for a minute and didn't look at her when he finally said, "It's never been personal. I don't hate you." "My blood is pretty fucking personal," she snapped. He didn't answer. "Are you going to stop it?" "Stop being nice?" "Yes." "I already said I don't hate you. I don't have any particular desire to be mean to you if that's what you're after." "The mark on your arm says otherwise," she persisted. "Come on. You don't expect me to believe that you're going to ruin your perfect 7-year streak of being an utter arse to me." He didn't meet her anger, but did rise to the level of sarcasm. "What can I say? It was a good run, but I'm done." Hermione huffed and crossed her arms. He was staring down at a little snowdrop he'd plucked, twisting it between his fingers and thumb. Whatever this stick was, it was grating on her nerves. She continued to stew, considering her next line of attack. It was preempted when Drago inexplicably volunteered, "I'm a Falmouth Falcons fan. Do you know why?" "I don't think there's anything I could possibly care less about," she sneered. Drago rolled his eyes. "All right. Well, it's because my father is a Falmouth fan. That's how it is when you're a kid, right? I've had a bedroom full of Falmouth and Slytherin gear my whole life. One of my best mates has always been for Kenmar, and we're constantly having a go at each other over it. But the thing is, even though you feel like you live and die by your team, and talk all kinds of shit and everyone takes it so seriously, I mean, people riot. But deep down, you know it's just a game." "Okay?" He paused, considering before he continued. "Did you know I tried to be friends with Potter?" "Bollocks!" The claim caught her completely off guard. This conversation was going to give her whiplash. "It's true. Before first year started." He grimaced. "I recognized him in Diagon and introduced myself. He was famous, and that made him interesting, so, like a good little Malfoy, I thought I'd make my useful alliance. I didn't give a bent nut if he brought down the Dark Lord." "What happened?" Hermione asked, bewildered. "Little twat wouldn't so much as take my hand." "He's always had good instincts." She smiled a little to herself, then recollected the matter at hand. "Sorry, is there a point to any of this?" "I'm a Falmouth fan. It was my team. It was my family's team, so it was the best team. Same as our Hogwarts house or our county or our family crest. I didn't think blood status was really any different. I thought my team was the best, but it was just supposed to be a game." "It's never been a game," she spat, repulsed. "No, I was naive." "You were cruel, bigoted asshole is what you were." He was quiet for another moment, his jaw working. "It was just easy. It was easy and fun, and everyone loved it. My father, Snape, my housemates, and honestly, it felt like an even match. You and Potter generally gave back as good as you got. People still think I bought my way onto the Quidditch team because of you. You punched me. I got transfigured into a rodent and bashed about by a professor. Potter almost killed me and got a spot of detention for his trouble. I know you just see me as an evil prick, but I didn't want anyone to get seriously hurt. That's why I—" "What? Why what?" she prompted. "Why I warned you at the World Cup." She stared hard at him, disbelieving. The cheek! He was fixated on the little flower that he'd mangled with all his fidgeting. After another moment, he continued. "Before I knew what was happening, people were dying. The Dark Lord was in my house, my father was in prison, and it was too late. Now I'm a full-fledged Death Eater and a blood traitor. I'm fucked, utterly fucked. So I think you can rest easy. Justice will be served." Hermione scoffed. "You can't honestly expect me to believe this is all just some kind of misunderstanding, that you're now miraculously reformed and have nothing against us dirty little mudbloods, now that you've had your turn of bad luck." "No, I don't expect you to believe that. I expect you to believe that I don't care." His temper finally flared. "I had a good life that's gone because of stupid, pointless bullshit. I'm 17 and my best prospects at the minute are Azkaban or living as a fugitive. I don't give a flying fuck what anyone else is doing, and I couldn't care less who anyone's parents are. Think what you want, but I don't care." "Oh, how wonderful." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "That does so very much good now." His fist clenched, finally crushing the snowdrop. "Would you have preferred I didn't interrupt the jolly time you were having with Aunt Bella?" His expression hardened and his voice turned cold and cruel. "Would you like to hear about how she generally follows up a few rounds of the Cruciatus curse? If you had your hopes up for an Avada, you'd have been disappointed. If she got bored with you before she killed you, then it probably would have been Greyback's turn. If there was anything left of you after that, it would have been for the snake. While I watched, is that what you wanted? Is that who you want me to be? You want me to call you a filthy little mudblood? Or perhaps I should have let you run merrily off after the hinky punk. Is that what you want?" Unaccountably, tears sprang into Hermione's eyes. She turned her face away and didn't answer. It was the very thing she'd been driving at when she'd picked this fight. But the words hurt. He'd confused her with smoke and mirrors, bad excuses and straw man arguments. But they slipped under her skin, like all his words so effortlessly seemed to. She pushed herself up to stand, blinking back tears, and started walking again without checking to see if he was following. He was. It was a silent trek. They crested the hill and found nothing beyond it except another expanse of rolling moor, with sharp peaks and ridges maybe 10 miles off. Hermione felt like she'd been wrung out, physically, mentally, emotionally. Still, as the afternoon wore away, she refused to be the one to call a halt to their grim march. When Draco finally suggested they take shelter under some trees at the base of a hill, her hands were trembling from low blood sugar, and her legs felt like jelly. She wouldn't talk to him, couldn't even look at him. Everything seemed raw and fragile. One word, one glance at him felt like it might break her just now. Why did everything have to be so complicated? Gryffindor good, Death Eaters bad. She liked that dichotomy. It was easy and familiar. She didn't want to parse the subtleties of Draco's experience, couldn't summon the will to explore ideas of willful ignorance, culpability, or the Rosalian Veil. She didn't want to think any more about what she would have done if her situation had been different. She didn't want to relitigate every old dispute. Not when getting from one day to the next was already hard enough. They built up a sizable fire, but the stand of trees they were in was thin and did little to keep out the wind as the night descended from a frigid edge. Tea and lentil stew warmed them for a bit, but without even the distraction of conversation, it was all a pretty miserable affair. Hermione reached into her bag for the blankets. It was only maybe 8 o'clock, but since screaming and crying weren't on the menu, there was nothing she wanted more than just to sleep. She was in the beaded back up to her elbow when her fingers found the soft flannel. She paused. Should she give Draco a blanket? She swallowed hard. It felt like an oddly profound question, a philosophical question, a deeply personal question. Was this forgiveness that she held in her hand? No, it was something else. Her head hurt. She pulled the blankets out, and before she could second-guess herself, she held one out to him. She was forced to glance up after a minute when he didn't take it. He was staring back at her, not moving to take the proffered flannel, pale features stark from the shadows and flames, another imitation of a fallen angel. It's cold. He gave her a searching look. We should share. Asking for more, but giving it too. It was somehow both the best and worst thing he could have done. She maintained her composure with a fierce determination as they wordlessly settled beneath the layered blankets, careful to put as much space between them as possible. It must be the end of the fucking world. God, she needed sleep. The morning dawned cold and gray with a drizzling sort of rain. Hermione resolved to set aside whatever yesterday had been. There would be time to hold Draco to account for anything and everything, to have a proper reckoning and tally their accounts, later. On a someday after the more immediate crisis had passed. Instead, when he asked if she'd ever heard of the Lie of Gingamore, she shook her head and asked him to tell it to her. In turn, she recited Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. They delicately debated the symbolism and competing interpretations of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and carefully, impersonal academic language. The precision with which they avoided all allusions to the personal in discussing the theme of the honor versus duty was a testament to their dedication to neutrality. There was none of the bickering and bantering from days previous. Neither tried to provoke the other. It was stilted and cautious in the way she thought their conversations probably should have been all along. Hermione kind of hated it. They kept near to the trees as the rain waxed and waned through the day, forcing them to stop and find shelter as best they could when it poured in earnest. A bit of rain in the morning was all right, but going to sleep in soaking wet clothes was a poor option. Hermione's thoughts drifted to Harry and Ron. She wondered if they were finally having to learn proper warming and drying spells in her absence. What would they do without their tent? Were they out wandering some forest too? When they'd stop, Draco would lean back against a tree with his hands in his pockets of Ron's baggy jeans, his wet hair sticking to his face. They seemed reflective, eyes wandering, the bleak landscape with a strangely wistful look on his face. A few times she caught him picking up a wand-sized stick and giving them an experimental flick. She couldn't help but smile a little to herself at that. It certainly wouldn't do any good, but she could understand the impulse. It was impossible to tell what time it was as the day's faint light leached slowly away, but they hadn't gone far by the time finding their footing became difficult. They didn't say much as they settled in before a small, smoky fire for the night, sitting with their backs against a tree and the blanket spread over their legs, nor when they eventually slid down to lay on the ground, side by side, to sleep. "I'm losing time," Hermione thought as she closed her eyes. "Losing touch. We shouldn't even exist." "Statistically speaking?" "Yeah. I know." The rain eased overnight, and they looked again to the ridges that they'd spotted 2 days ago, more ready to tackle the long stretch of open ground under a blue sky. It would also be a change in tactics, which seemed prudent given how fruitless their current efforts were proving. It wasn't just that they weren't finding their way out of wherever this was, but there was nothing to supplement meals with, and they hadn't had a proper wash in days. Hermione was getting increasingly desperate for a shower. She wasn't even sure whether finding a wand or finding a hot shower was her top priority anymore. They had both taken to wearing jeans during the day, and their more comfortable bottoms at night, but a singular change of clothes was in no way equal to the daily smoke and dirt and sweat. The occasional underpowered wandless cleaning charm would only do so much. It was getting demoralizing. The only consolation was in seeing Draco, usually so immaculately dressed and coiffured, getting downright tatty. Stubble was slowly, patchily overtaking his jaw, though she hadn't brought that up yet. Making him aware of a problem for which there was no solution would only be an invitation to an open-ended whining. And besides, if she was honest, she wasn't confident she could convincingly mock it. It looked good. But the hair was fair game. She'd smiled to herself at his profound distress over pushing lank strands of hair off his forehead in what might have been his first honest-to-goodness experience with greasiness. Between his silky, almost white hair and her dark curls, she definitely prevailed in the needs-less-washing category, as it was paying off in spades at present. When she ribbed him about looking like he'd revived his youthful love affair with hair gel, he whined and wheedled until she gave in and cast a scourge of eye for him. Afterward they set off, tins of juniper berry tea in hand, Draco practically preening. Unfortunately, the moor was much more rugged than it had appeared from the hilltop. It was all grass, which was a nice change from rocks and brambles, but it was arduous, and it seemed like they were spending more time going up and down than moving forward. It was also impossible to tell how far they had come or how far they had to go, because the hills they'd left and the peaks that lay ahead were out of view. It was the warmest it had been in days, and the sight of the sun should have been cheering, but they had lost sense of direction and had no idea if they were following even a moderately straight path. It was just one more thing to add to the growing list of problems Hermione didn't have a solution to. For the first time in her life, she desperately wished she had a broom. They continued trading stories and bits of poetry as the day wore on. It was a welcome distraction for Hermione, who, in the midst of an increasingly metaphorical-seeming wasteland, was earnestly beginning to wonder what was left of her when all her choices were gone. After her books and friends and magic had been stripped away, she'd never felt so powerless, never less like herself. An unmoored soul. She tried to shake it off, but existential dread is nothing if not persistent. "Did you ever hear the quote, 'Don't let your happiness depend on something you may lose'?" she asked impulsively. "I'm not sure," he frowned. "C.S. Lewis. I was just thinking about it." "I think my happiness has been about 97% material things for the last few years. Not much else to work with. Well, aside from being grateful not to have been disemboweled for sport or fed to great bloody snakes." The joke fell a bit flat. Hermione hummed. "I think the stories we keep, our memories, what we know, it's got to be something, doesn't it? Maybe it's not happiness, but more like self. It's what's left of us now, isn't it?" "I don't think anyone is generous enough to consider the sum of me, in a cumulative sense, to be my knowledge." "What about your experiences?" "I would hope not," he said dryly. They were edging back into dangerous territory. "What about potential?" she offered. "What we are capable of, given what we have and who we are." He looked at her from the side of his eye. "I could live with that." "Not sure it's my best moment for that interpretation, but it might be apt." She gave a rueful smile. It wasn't her preferred conclusion. The conversation veered back into safer territory after that. When they finally came across a hill that rose a bit higher than the others, they were able to catch sight of the peaks they were meant to be arriving at. They were not remotely close. In all likelihood, they'd been walking almost perfectly perpendicular to the course they ought to have been on since noon. Well, should we try to head back that way? Hermione indicated the direction of the hills and trees they'd come from. We can't be far. They were far enough. When not discussing all manner of strange, esoteric nonsense with Draco, she was muttering away to Ron about his shitty Deluminator, because all strategy was apparently pointless. They were just wandering in obscurity, possibly in circles. They had kept up a relentless pace, but she honestly had no idea if it could be counted as a successful day. For all she knew, if they'd walked for 20 minutes in the opposite direction that morning, they might have stumbled on a shopping mall. Hermione liked goals, data, and measures of success. There was none of that to be had. Instead, they were preparing to once again build a fire and a shelter as best they could in a small grove, full of trees that scarcely even had leaves yet, possibly worse off than they'd been when they started out. It had been a week they'd been wandering now. The lapse of time seemed all the more dramatic because spring was coming on. There were buds on the trees, and even early violets clustered around, like the unexpected sunshine. It should have been cheering, but it only reminded Hermione of how long she had been living out of her little beaded bag. Since August. It was April. This was the first clear night they'd spent in the open. As she lay down to sleep, she marveled at the stars, bright and thick overhead, like a flurry of snow. Their light glazed trees and hilltops like an ancient rite of celestial baptism. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and in a forgetful moment her soul felt like it was reaching toward that ecstasy of transcending the world to join some resplendent harmony with the universe. But then her relentless intellect whispered about the science of light pollution and assured her the blanket of stars signified her isolation, not her completion. This was nowhere. They were nowhere. Her parents, her friends, she'd let them all down. So many people were depending on her, and she was failing. She couldn't even help herself. She bit her lip as she felt tears prickling her eyes. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't cry. It was no good. She squeezed her eyes shut and trembled all over as the tears came, desperately trying to keep silent. The idea of Draco knowing her weakness, mocking it, was somehow worse than anything. If she could do nothing else, she could at least keep her pride. She tried to steady her breathing, but her anxiety was relentless. She was helpless, utterly helpless, useless. A little whimper escaped her as the tears streamed over her temples. In that moment, she understood her meaningless with a profound and devastating clarity. There was a slight movement under the blanket, and then she felt the brush of Draco's hand over her palm. Long, warm fingers interlaced with her own and gave a little squeeze. Something inside her broke. Fucking Malfoy! She cried harder. He didn't say anything and didn't let go. When she fell asleep sometime later, her eyes were dry and burning, and her hand was still clutching his under the covers.